Welcome to On the Margin with Ethelbert Miller. My guest today is Elijah Wald. Elijah Wald is a music journalist, guitarist, and cultural historian. Elijah Wald is the author of Jelly Roll Blues, Censored Songs, and Hidden Histories. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're having you back. You were on a show back in February 29th where we discussed your other book, Escaping the Delta, Robert Johnson and the Invention of the Blues, and I thought that was a very fine discussion, Elijah. So, thank you for coming back and discussing Jelly Roll Morton. You are in Paris. What are you, like part of the Literary Olympics or something like that?
No, actually, my wife is French, so we're actually here on a family visit.
Okay, so you're taking a break from writing two books this year.
Well, I'll be writing on this trip too.
Okay. Well,
There's
what are you
no
working
escape.
on? What's the next book?
I'm doing a short history of rock and roll, and I'm doing a new edition of my book on Mexican drug trafficking ballads.
Okay, all right. And these sounds like titles that were probably what, 26 or 27?
Something like that.
Like
Yeah.
that. Well, we look forward to having you back. So now we have a repeat, and then we have a three-peat. So I'll definitely try to make sure that this is an outlet because I think some of the work that you're doing, Elijah Wall, um, I think supports what we're doing here at WPFW in terms of music and jazz, especially in blues. Um, let's talk about Jelly Roll Morton.
Sure.
He was born in New Orleans on October 20th, 1890. His name was Ferdinand Joseph Lamoth. Is it Lamoth or Lamoth?
Boy, there are infinite arguments about how that one was spelled and pronounced, but let's go with Lamont.
Okay, let's ask your wife. Okay. Okay. Talk about. He started playing when he was 14 years old. Describe his early years and what was happening in terms of the musical world around him.
Sure. Well, the interesting thing about Jelly Roll Morton, or one of them, is he actually had three separate careers. He started out when he was roughly 14, 15, and first of all was a blues specialist. And he was playing piano and singing blues in New Orleans and all up and down the Gulf Coast. I mean, Biloxi was a major base for him. He went over to Pensacola. Um, and he toured around basically till around 1910. What he's known for is having played in the houses of prostitution in New Orleans, but that was really a relatively minor part of what he did. He was mostly playing for black audiences in honky tonks. And then around 1911, 1912, he broke into vaudeville and he worked for about 5 or 6 years as a vaudeville comedian with a woman partner, actually in blackface doing musical comedy. And then he switched over into managing nightclubs and running his own bands. And really, what we know him best for is that third career, where he became the first great composer and arranger in the history of jazz. But what led to my book is that because he stopped doing blues around 1911, just before blues got commodified, first on sheet music and then on records, when he remembered and talked about blues, he was talking about that first decade of the 20th century before blues had in any way been popularized outside the Black community, and particularly the Black sporting world.
Hmm. Why do we just know the third chapter? Is that because of lack of research or scholarship?
It's there are really two reasons. One reason is because we have records. We don't really have recordings until the 1920s. So, because a lot of the history has been written based on recordings, that tends to be the central thing. The other thing is that's when he became historically important. I mean, as a blues singer, he was just one more kid singing blues on the Gulf Coast, and there were a lot of blues players who were certainly better known in that world. And likewise, as a vaudeville comedian, he was one of many. As a band leader, he was extraordinary.
Hmm.
But because of that, we would probably never have known about that earlier period, except he ended up in Washington, D.C. in 1938. He was running a nightclub there and was introduced to Alan Lomax, who was the head of the folklore archive at the Library of
Yeah, I want
Congress.
to talk about him a little later in our show because I
Yeah,
think
and
that's important.
A lot of people get this story wrong and think that Lomax came to Morton. Morton went to the Library of Congress
Hmm.
and said, I know the whole history of jazz. You should record me telling that story. And because of that, we have this amazing document of 8 hours of him talking and demonstrating the music he grew up with. And really, that was the starting point for this book.
You know, you mentioned just a few minutes ago about Jelly Roll Morton being like a band leader and a composer. He also was an arranger. And what does an arranger do, and how innovative were the things that Morton was doing in terms of being an arranger?
Hugely innovative. When Morton got into recording, which is really what he's, where he's known as an arranger, they were essentially two strains of jazz. They were the people out of New Orleans, like King Oliver, who really didn't make arrangements. They basically, everybody got together and they played for 3 minutes and then they stopped. And then you had this other world of white bands like Paul Whiteman's orchestra, which were very tightly arranged, which, they'd have this section of the group playing and then that section, and then maybe a solo, or maybe it would all be written out. And they didn't really have the swing of the New Orleans groups. They didn't have what we now would recognize as a jazz feeling. And Morton's genius was to put those two things together and to write these very tightly arranged parts. For example, he wrote several pieces with clarinet trios, which were completely written out, and then with space also for soloists, and all of it with a rhythm section that was out of New Orleans and had that hot feel. So it's really he's where people like Ellington and all of these later people come out of. This
Hmm.
idea that you could swing as hard as the bands that were just improvising and blowing, and be as tightly arranged as the bands that had a classical background.
That's an interesting point you've just made, Elijah Wald, and it leads me to ask the question: who are some of the contemporary, arrangers today? Who would we look for? If I was a music student, coming out of like Juilliard or whatever, and I wanted to work with somebody, who would be seen today as a major arranger?
I'm not the person for that question, I'm
Okay.
afraid. I mean, by now, there are, after Ellington, arranging became so central in jazz
Hmm.
that, I mean, honestly, in the world of bop, there still are a lot of people who don't arrange. But
Hmm.
I think, any jazz big band now, any jazz band that has 8 or 10 pieces is going to be very much arranged, at least if they're going to record.
Right.
I mean, I'm living in Philadelphia. There's a huge movement now of young people who are going back and doing like Fletcher Henderson style arrangements,
Hmm.
um, which is exciting to me because I like that.
Hmm.
But there's a whole world of people also doing modern arranging, and I
Hmm.
don't know that world well.
Okay. Um, Jelly Roll Morton was a ragtime as well as a jazz pianist. What's unique about ragtime, and what are its origins?
That's a trick question because the line between ragtime and jazz was invented later. I mean, for example, Sidney Bechet, who was the great New Orleans, we would now say jazz clarinet player and soprano saxophone player, hated the word jazz and insisted till the day he died that everything he played was ragtime, and that the music that Louis Armstrong played, that King Oliver played, that all of that was ragtime. Um, there's no, to me, it's silly to try to argue about where that shifts over.
Hmm.
Um, Certainly someone like Jelly Roll Morton would think of what Scott Joplin played, which is what we tend to think of as ragtime. He thought of that as the St. Louis style. And for him, the difference between that and the New Orleans style was that the New Orleans style had a different kind of swing, what he called the Latin tinge,
Hmm.
which you might think of as a more Caribbean kind of feel to it rhythmically. But he didn't say one was ragtime and the other was jazz.
Well, if we take a look at your work, Elijah Wall, do you see your work as being the type of work that would say explore and sort of maybe help redefine these terms?
Um, Not really. I would say more that my work is trying to persuade people to get away from these
Or get
terms.
away from the term? Because you think
I
the
I
terms are
think,
superimposed on the musicians?
yeah, I mean, I think that, for example, is this blues, is this jazz, is this ragtime, are kind of meaningless questions that wouldn't have meant anything to the people who were making the music. I mean, the definitions they used were, for example, dance rhythms. Is this a waltz? Is it a one step? Is it a two step? Is it a foxtrot?
Hmm.
Is it a slow drag? Which blues, when it first comes in New Orleans, is pretty much synonymous with slow drag. It's a rhythm for late night, slow dancing, close together, rubbing bodies.
Right. The rubbing of bodies.
Yeah. Belly rub was
Belly rub.
another term
Right.
for it.
Right. Well, going back, look at these terms. There is that sort of belief, and I want to get your opinion on it, that Jelly Roll Morton created jazz around 1902.
Well, that's a belief strictly limited to Jelly Roll Morton himself.
Why would he say
Um,
something like that?
yeah. Well, the reason he said, he had a couple of reasons. First of all, the year 1902, I think, was really picked because W.C. Handy claimed that he had heard blues and started writing this stuff down around 1902. And so what happened was that that whole story came out of the fact that Ripley, Robert Ripley of Ripley's Believe It
Believe
or
it or
Not,
not.
did a radio show with W.C. Handy, who is known as the father of the blues, and Louis Armstrong, in which he credited W.C. Handy with writing the first blues, which was Memphis blues, and with that then being the beginning of jazz.
Mm.
And Jelly Roll Morton strongly resented giving credit to anyone not from New Orleans. He didn't insist on it being him, but it had to be New Orleans people. And he then wrote an open letter that got published in the Pittsburgh Courier and most famously in Downbeat, the jazz magazine, saying W.C. Handy is a liar. Jazz came from New Orleans, and in fact, I invented it myself in 1902. But to be fair, he also says, and before I was ever playing, there were people playing blues in New Orleans. And he gives this whole list that's actually an interesting list because it's all people who we've never heard of,
Mm.
who he says were
When you say
playing
that
blues before.
you say that it sounds like it's a part of like an African American tradition, like, well, I'm going to declare myself the prophet of such and such, and start
Yeah,
my own
it's
church.
very much like the birth of rap.
Yeah.
I mean, we've gone through that. We just this year have been celebrating
Right.
the beginning of rap, and you can say Sugar Hill Gang and Rapper's Delight, and then people will say, yeah, but those guys weren't even rappers. They were just copying some lines from Busy Bee Starsky. And then you can say Busy Bee Starsky didn't even really matter because what really mattered were the DJs
Right.
like Flash and Herc. And it's that same kind of
Well,
discussion.
everything knows it begins in the South Bronx. Will we agree with that?
I'm not going there
I'm not going there. I'm
because
just
then there's the whole group who'll say the guys in the South Bronx were all coming from Jamaica and it was just Jamaican toasting. And it's
okay.
true that Herc and Flash,
Right.
all had that background. I'm not going there.
Okay.
You know,
Well, we're not going there. Well, let me talk about a place that I believe you have gone, and it leads us into talking about Alice Lomax. I'm assuming in your research that you have used the Library of Congress,
a lot.
right? A lot. I'm wondering. I mean, we're here in Washington D.C. Walk us through what's there that you find so interesting. For example, if I was coming from out of town and say I'm going to go to the Library of Congress, based on what we're talking today about music and things of that sort, what's the scope of their holdings?
Oh my God. I couldn't begin to answer that because it's getting bigger by literally by the day. But if we're talking Lomax, he took over specifically the folk life collection. And that's actually a sort of crazy story because I also did a lot of research. There was a man named Robert Winslow Gordon
Hmm.
not well known. He was the first director
And then there was
of the
also
Folklife
and there was also
collection.
Alan Jabor who was there.
That's much later,
That's much later.
but I'm
Okay.
talking before
Right.
Lomax.
Okay. Oh, right. Okay.
And where that actually starts, Robert Winslow Gordon had a column in Adventure magazine, which was a men's magazine that had like short stories and stories of, like my travels in the Arctic, my trip to the North Pole. And he had a column called Songs That Men Sing,
Hmm.
where he asked people to send in lyrics of songs that were out there, that like lumberjacks and cowboys and sailors sang, and got thousands and thousands of those. And that was the beginning of the folklore archive. And I actually went into a lot of those letters because those are very interesting,
Hmm.
because it's mostly white informants, not entirely, but mostly. But there are people writing about the earliest blues as something, they heard
Hmm.
back in the 1890s, 1900. But then John Lomax, Alan's father, had meanwhile been collecting cowboy songs and began collecting African American music as well, already in 1908, 1909. And Alan then started going out with him in 1933 as a
Let's
teenager.
let's flesh that out.
Yeah.
How does they take, for example, John? How does he get interested in this study?
Um, that's another of these strange stories. John Lomax had grown up in Texas. He had grown up hearing cowboy songs. He went to and he got interested in that and started writing down some of the songs. Got to Harvard as a student and was taking classes about English literature that included the Old English ballads, and went to George Lyman Kittredge, who was the great grand old man of that department at Harvard, and said, we've got these songs in Texas that are a lot like that.
Hmm.
And Kittredge, everyone else, everyone in ballad scholarship was treating the old Elizabethan English ballads as literature and the newer stuff as trash.
Hmm.
But Kittredge said, that's fascinating. You should collect those things. And so, inspired by Kittredge at Harvard, John Lomax began seriously collecting the cowboy ballads and actually published the first edition in 1910 or 1911.
Hmm.
And it went together with what was happening politically, because Teddy Roosevelt, of
Hmm.
course, was into the idea of the manly pursuits and the Great West.
Hmm.
But one of the interesting things about John Lomax is he completely understood cowboy culture to be not just white cowboy culture. He collected a lot of his material from black cowboys. For example, Home on the Range was collected from a black cowboy. And one of the interesting things of John Lomax is he didn't distinguish. You often can't tell from his notes whether the person he was collecting from was black or white, because his view was in the cowboy culture that was irrelevant, that they all sang the same songs.
Hmm.
The only distinction he made is that he said a white cowboy would just sing a song the way he knew it, but many of the black cowboys would, if you reached the end and you said what happened next, would start improvising more verses.
Hmm. Well, I want to ask you this question. We go from Alan to John. If I'm not mistaken, John spent a lot of time working with Zora Neale Hurston.
That's now Alan. John is the father,
Right,
Alan
right.
is the son.
Alan, that's what I mean. Alan. Alan.
Not a lot of time. They made one trip together. They
Okay.
did not get along. Interestingly enough, because Zora Neale Hurston was already moving toward her conservative politics
Oh.
and felt that Alan was a bit too was in fact she warned John that Alan was falling under the thrall of the communists. But they
The-
did one trip down south together, yeah.
oh, okay. You
And
know,
she was also very instrumental in, of course, in collecting for the Library of Congress, then on her own. I mean, she did some collecting in Florida that was hugely important, but that was separate from the Lomaxes.
when you say that, I always remember Verda Grosvenor, who did Vibration Cooking. She had, this is when she was at NPR, and she pulled me in her office and she said, listen to this. And it was the first time I heard the voice of Zora Neale Hurston. from one of those Library of Congress, like, and it's like, you have these images of writers like Richard Wright, people like that, as William Hurston, but to actually hear their voice was like eye-opening for me.
Well, Zora Neale Hurston, in particular, for the project I did for the Jelly Roll Blues, she recorded a bunch of songs she'd heard her whole life growing up in Eatonville, Florida, including some of the few uncensored early blues, like a version of the song known as Funky Butt, for
Hmm.
example, which there are lots of versions that got recorded later by people in New Orleans. And Jelly Roll Morton claimed it was written by Buddy Bolden, um, the man who legendarily led one of the first jazz bands. But Zora Neale Hurston recorded a version she had learned in Eatonville, Florida, uh, just as early or earlier than Morton recalled hearing it in New Orleans. She
So
called
just,
it
just, just, just,
Pampa.
right, just for the record, before we went on the air, I was going to ask you to do the funky butt, but we'll do that. We'll do that sometime later. But I want to ask you two more questions before we have a break. Elijah Wall. Um,
Sure.
we're getting into this Alan Lomax recording Jelly Roll Morton's in 1938 at the Library of Congress.
Yeah.
Explain to us what was how did the Prohibition era affect and change black music?
Well, it affected and changed all of American music because it closed all the bars for 13 years. And not only the bars, but there had been that whole world of prostitution, which I can't exaggerate how different that world was. I mean, for example, in New York City, from 14th Street up to 40th Street, 3 blocks wide, that was one of 5 prostitution areas. That's 30 blocks of houses of prostitution, sometimes 8 houses on a block. And that was only one of the districts. Washington had a district, Baltimore had a district, New Orleans famously, Storyville, but every city. And that was a whole world of entertainment. But also, there were all the bars, of course, and they all had pianos, and men would hang around in the bars and sing with each other. And that whole world was shut down by prohibition.
Mm,
And there's this story that people tell that it just got wilder during Prohibition. Everyone was down in the speakeasies. But what that leaves out is because they were illegal, they tried to keep the noise level down.
mm,
So you did not have bands in the speakeasies. You normally did not even have a piano in the speakeasies because you didn't want to do anything that might lead to the neighbors complaining and the cops coming in.
right.
So a whole musical, basically the public musical world of small groups and piano players was simply shut down. And all you had was moving to big bands in ballrooms
Mm. You
because
you
just the bar scene was gone.
right. You mentioned something here. And I'm just going to read this little excerpt. This is in their chapter, Mamie's Blues, and you write the following: Sex work was often unpleasant, but so was slaving over a wash tub or a hot stove. And you could wear nice clothes, live in the most vibrant part of town, and make more in an hour than a domestic worker made in a week. If you worked in a parlor house, you also had more protection and potential access to powerful men who, if played adroitly, might guarantee bank loans or fund your own business ventures. As in other professions, the few who started as workers and ended up owning businesses were exceptional, but the possibility existed. That I found that very interesting in terms of you sort of like flesh out what was happening to black women at this particular time.
Yeah, no, and I don't want to romanticize the sex working angle. I mean, it was always a terrible job, but the options available to Black women in this time were so limited. And in that world, some of them ended up millionaires. And, I have a whole section on the woman named Ready Money, who Jelly Roll Morton mentioned as a pickpocket in New Orleans, and who ended up owning one of the largest hotels in San Diego with a staff of 60 people and a nightclub downstairs with a full big band, largest black hotel between Tijuana and Los Angeles. Um, and I just wanted to stress the extent to which those women were hugely important in the community and have been completely ignored by history.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, until this book, there hasn't been more than a sentence written about Ready Money.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this whole set of women, the history of places like Storyville have been written by white jazz fans. So you get the idea that the important people there were King Oliver and Buddy Bolden and Louis Armstrong and Jelly Roll Morton. But there were these women like Ida Jackson, Louise Abadie, Eloise Blankenstein. Lulu White is the most famous, the Countess Willie Piazza, who were hiring and firing musicians. I mean, they were the real celebrities of that world. And I just wanted to make that front and center.
Right. Well, you mentioned how Jelly Roll Morton comes to Lomax to do at the Library of Congress, which gets into the thing, an interesting power relationship. Did Lomax try to suppress some of the music that was recorded, or did he feel there was no market for it? Did Morton, knowing that he's playing to Lomax, play certain material? And I'm just looking at this relationship.
Sure. That's complicated. I mean, first of all, Lomax was not trying to find commercial music. Quite the contrary. Lomax felt that commercial music was the enemy,
Mm.
and that what he wanted was the folk music people were playing in their own communities. And so, yeah, there was a tug of war because Morton, what was important to Morton was the fact that he was one of the great composers and band leaders in the history of jazz. Whereas Lomax felt that jazz was modern pop music that was destroying the authentic Black culture.
Mm.
So Lomax was trying to get Morton to give him examples of the stuff the people were singing in the bars that didn't become famous.
What's the age difference between the two of them?
That's Lomax was, I'm going to not get this exactly, but Lomax was just like 22 or 23 years old. Morton was already about 50.
So that's
It
an
was the
interesting
very
dynamic.
beginning of Lomax's career, and it was the very end of Morton's.
Yeah, that's an interesting relationship right there. I mean, you can see Morton trying to document something, and Lomax being in his youth, just maybe fascinated by things. you know.
Yeah, well, there's that. There also is the fact that Morton is trying to jumpstart his career. Morton feels like the world has passed him by, and he wants to get back on top. I mean, 1938, the biggest thing in popular music is the Count Basie Orchestra, and they're playing pretty much straight old blues. And Morton is listening to Count Basie and thinking, if that can be the number one record in the country, I can be the number one record in the country. And come on, the clarinet player, the Benny Goodman. Benny Goodman's theme song is actually Jelly Roll Morton's King Porter's Stomp. So Morton is thinking, if people just knew I was there, I could be a top star now. Whereas Lomax is completely devoted to the problem of preserving the oldest Black music before those people die.
Let's make this complicated, but make you into like Dr. Freud. Is Lomax trying to supplant his father as a researcher scholar?
There certainly is a part of that, certainly is a piece of it. Absolutely. But the other thing is, he's on a mission where when he gets a 50-year-old man in front of him, what he wants to know is, what did you hear when you were a kid? Because that's the music that if I don't record it now, we're going to lose it. And the music that's happening now, we don't have to worry about. There are lots of people recording.
Okay, we don't want to lose you this morning.
Okay.
We're gonna take a little break, Elijah Wald. My guest this
Sure.
morning is Elijah Wald, and he's been discussing his book Jelly Roll Blues, Censored Songs and Hidden History. My name is Ethelbert Miller. The show's On the Margin. The station's WPFW 89.3 FM.
On Wednesday, May 15th, 2024, the 76th anniversary of the ongoing Palestinian Nakba, or catastrophe, and the resistance to Israeli apartheid, Radio Free Palestine will launch at midnight on WPFW and dozens of stations across North America to air 24 hours of programming from radio stations and producers across 5 continents. There will be separate streams in Arabic, English, French, and Spanish. Our presentation will be in English and include discussions, speeches, music, poetry, and updates from student encampments. That's Radio Free Palestine, beginning at midnight, May 15th, on WPFW, Radio for the Resistance.
Okay, we're back on the margin with my guest, Elijah Wald. Elijah, you write in your book that much of the history in your book is painful and ugly. What did you mean by that?
Just what I said. Yeah, I'm talking about the music of Black Americans at a moment when, as we know that history, it was both a moment of incredible new freedoms and a moment when a lot of the white power structure was devoted to trying to crush that possibility. So you're dealing with people who are fighting against infinite numbers of problems. And one of the problems is that their voices are not tending to get preserved. And for me, a huge part of this project was trying to find those voices, which, because the songs got preserved, that's one of the few examples we have. But the songs also were heavily, heavily censored.
Mhm.
And so I was trying to get past that and trying to get to the uncensored voices. And those voices are often telling very difficult stories. They often are the voices of people, for example, women working in prostitution, and particularly women working in street prostitution. Um, there are also, I also preserve some white voices of songs that are very explicitly racist in ways that people who like old time country music sometimes want to forget. So, it's an attempt to really get the voices of the people, yeah, who are struggling against all sorts of issues.
Well, let's look at what many people make reference to, and you also do this also. Um, you look at these recordings from 1938, Jelly Roll Morton, and then you say, okay, let's look at what's happening in terms of rap hip hop today, in terms of, people might be offended by the language, but somebody would say, well, look at the language that we were using in 38, you know. Um,
Yeah,
but then you just said something very interesting, Elijah Wall, that you talk about, you put it in a certain context. This music is coming out of some, it's a response to something. Do you make that connection today with rap and hip hop? Do you see the connection?
this is again, I always make it more complicated.
You do.
The answer, because there are two things that are happening simultaneously. There is there is the music that's coming out of the Black community, which is often talking about the most difficult and the most troubled corners of the Black community. And there is a white market that sometimes likes to popularize the ugliest aspects of that music. So you get, Grandmaster Flash doing The Message. On the one hand, you get um, NWA, and then you get the white kids in the suburbs who hear NWA doing F the police. And instead of hearing it as a protest or as a comedy skit about life in that world, hear it as those scary Black people. And so then you get groups like the Ghetto Boys who are going more and more into that and more selling to white kids in the suburbs. And exactly the same thing happened back in the beginning of the 20th century, where you have, for example, songs like Stagger Lee and Frankie and Johnny, which are coming out of the Black community, in that case, in both of those in St. Louis. And then you get versions in the white community where they're adding all these dirty words and violence to it because they're romanticizing that. And then on the other hand, you have songs like what Jelly Roll Morton was singing, which are dealing in some ways with similar situations, but are much less romanticized. Like what is called the Murder Ballad, which is the song that got me into all of this.
Why did why
Because
why did that get you involved in this?
this got me into it because this is a song that Jelly Roll Morton recorded as an example of what people used to sing in New Orleans back when he was a teenager. And it's in blues form, it's a 12-bar blues. But what he records, it's a narrative ballad. It's half an hour long. There are 59 verses, and that isn't even the whole thing because it starts partway through. And no one knew, and none of us who were historians knew that there had been epic half-hour long blues ballads because this is the only one ever recorded. And though it was recorded in 1938, it was not released until 1997 because he used the language people used in bars. He used the F word, he used the C word. And because of that, those records were never released. And we didn't know that there had ever been these long, really, that's a fascinating song because it's completely novelistic. He's telling the story of a woman who kills another woman, is sent to jail, has an affair with a woman, a lesbian affair in jail, eventually dies there. And it's being told completely realistically in the language of that world. And we never knew that that existed because it
Well,
had been censored.
well, now here the question comes. We discovered the material like what you were saying. It's in your book.
Yeah,
How does this affect us, and how should this be looked at? Should we look at this in terms of music and just song lyrics? Should we now say look at these closely and say, okay, I'm a sociologist or I'm a psychologist, and what does this all mean? In terms of conditions affecting African Americans.
to me, I want to do all of that. To me, it is interesting, not just, I'm always interested in the world that music comes out of. And for me, the central question is always not who is on stage playing it, but who is listening to it, because that's what creates the world. I think music history people pay way too much attention to musicians and not enough attention to audiences. Because musicians always are doing what, if you've heard of a musician, you've heard of them because they had an audience and they are playing the music for that audience. And the audience is what determines the scene. So that was a huge part of this, was trying to understand music that we always got channeled through white jazz fans and white blues fans listening to the records, and instead ask who was listening to this in 1905, 1907, 1910 in St. Louis or Chicago or New Orleans, and who were those people and what were their lives like, and how does the music express that and fit that, to what extent, perfect example in rap again, something I already mentioned, F the Police. So many white people heard that as a violent song, whereas I think everyone in the original audience heard it as a comedy skit. I'm not saying it wasn't an angry comedy skit, it was an angry comedy skit. But you hear this again and again in blues versus that for the original audience. The original audience would have been laughing.
Well, let me ask you a question. My interest as a writer is the interest in language, and I want you
Yeah,
to focus on two terms. Um, Talk about and how they move into our language, into especially the mainstream.
sure.
Talk about funk and funky butt.
Yeah. Well, funk is a really interesting one because funk was a word that had been around for at least 200 or 300 years. It had originally meant smoke, like smokiness, and then just got to mean any kind of thick atmosphere, hard to breathe, smelly. And then it gets, well, what's his name who wrote Living the Blues? Black newspaper man.
Frank Marshall Davis.
Frank Marshall Davis, exactly. Frank Marshall Davis said, when I was a young man, funk wasn't a kind of music. Funk was the term for unwashed genitalia. And when people talked about funky music, they meant the music that you played for, I say, when I call these things dirty songs, I say, let's remember, this was the music of people who were living with dirt. They were doing manual labor. And in New Orleans in particular, they didn't have regular running water and a full sewage system until 1909. So, Buddy Bolden famously, his theme was this thing, Funky Butt. And it was this song about playing in these smelly places. And he, opened the window, let
Yeah,
some air get in.
I thought I heard Buddy Bolden say.
Dirty butt, funky butt,
Right,
take it
right,
away.
right.
Thought I heard Buddy Bolden shout, open up the window, let the bad air out. But you listen, you read interviews with people, and they'll say this over and over. Oh, yeah, you go into some of those clubs that smelled like burnt onions and cigar smoke. Or, you'd get these women in off the boats. And uh, I'm not going to quote the Zora Neale Hurston verse for Funky, but I'm so glad that law was passed. Women in Tampa got to wash there, and it rhymes.
Right. Okay. Well, talking about that, you mentioned how blues lyrics have often been misunderstood by outsiders. Do you feel, looking at your work, and I'm looking at Zora Neale Hurston and her relationship with Robert Hemingway, where Hemingway said that he felt that a black woman needed to write Zora Neale Hurston's biography. He did good groundworking work, but he felt
Yep.
black women should come. When we look at these lyrics, do you feel that there's a need for black women scholars to examine some of these lyrics in terms of looking at the sex workers?
Well, I mean, the short answer to that is there is a wave now of terrific work being done by Black women. I mean, the most familiar, of course, is Saidiya Hartman,
Right.
who just did that terrific book on exactly this. But there are 5 or 6 books that I cite in my book by Black women specifically on the world of Black sex workers. Of course, there was Angela Davis's work on the blues, which is absolutely seminal for this. Um,
Let me ask you a
I have
question.
friends. I mean,
Right.
Kimberly Mack
Right.
now. There are a bunch of, this is in fact a field that a
Mhm.
lot of Black women writers are getting into. Of course, I'm white, I'm male, I'm an outsider in this world.
But let's
And a
talk about
lot
that.
of,
But let's hold that point.
yeah,
You're an outside in this world, but you're also part of this academic world. And I'm looking at something where I saw a very interesting relationship. I saw this relationship between Robert Hemingway and Valerie Boyd, who did it with do the Hurston. And he opened his research files and stuff for Valerie Boyd to use and stuff. Looking at you today, are you in touch with any African American women scholars to a point where you say, okay, I'm really happy that this person is coming along. I like talking to this person on a regular basis. Maybe you're on somebody's.
sure.
Are there any names that you would mention that, like maybe you're sitting on somebody's thesis committee?
Well, I mean, I'm not principally an academic.
Right.
I
You're
mean,
like
all the
me.
people I'm going to mention have more of an academic position than I have. I mean, Kimberly Mack is a good friend. Uh, Tawana, oh my God, Tawana Steptoe, who's done some terrific work on blues in Texas. Zandria Robinson, who's absolutely the queen and one of my favorite writers on the planet right now. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm
Right.
65 and I'm losing proper names, so names aren't coming back as fast as they used to.
Okay. I'm
But yeah, no,
right.
absolutely. And a huge part, a lot of what I was doing with this book in particular was just there are a lot of young scholars who think that everything is on the internet.
Mm.
And part of what I was trying to do in this book is just say there is an incredible amount of stuff in archives
Well, let
that
me
has
ask you
not
this
been
question. Right.
digitized.
Okay, let's ask you a question. Because you have the lyrics in these, okay, and these things with this waiting for you to show up. Is there a possibility in some of the lyrics, like, where someone say that somebody would say, well, Elijah Wald just got it wrong, is there any type of thing where you look up and somebody say, well, or maybe you're wrestling at some lyrics and you say, okay, I don't know exactly what's being said here. I have a feeling, but I'm not certain. And then somebody comes along and says, oh, Elijah Wald doesn't know what he's talking about.
Um, well, to underline that, I in fact sent drafts of this book to a bunch of other people. And there were a couple of lyrics that absolutely somebody came back and said, you've got this completely wrong. That's not what they're saying. And that's why I sent it around to other people,
Right, right.
hoping people will catch that. And I'm sure there are other things in this book that people will catch that way. I mean, And I should also say, there are a lot of lyrics that all I have is written transcriptions,
Mm,
where I'm pretty sure that what I'm reading is wrong, where
mm,
I'm pretty sure that somebody misheard something. And in a couple of places, I say that. I say, this is what he wrote down. I think this is not what actually the person was saying.
mm. Well,
Yes, I
let
mean,
me ask
there's
you a
layer
question on
upon
that.
layer upon
Right,
layer of
right.
that, of
Let me
misunderstanding.
let me ask you a question on that, okay? Because you're dealing with transcription, and
Yeah,
we're dealing with. I'm concerned as a writer, the spelling of words.
yeah,
Okay, because what happens sometimes I can say, okay, I hear something phonetically, but how am I going to actually write? How am I writing this down? All of a sudden, like, do I drop the
yeah,
participle? I mean,
yeah,
do I correct a spelling because there's a thing like, well, I know what someone's saying, but I'm going to correct their. I remember when somebody would say, um,
yeah.
Elijah, well, we're talking about the blues, and that's the way they said it. Sounded like they never even worked in the field or anything. I mean, it was intellectual, and they say,
Yep.
okay, they would correct somebody's spelling because somebody would say they had less education.
Yeah. I mean, my own choice when I'm doing this, if I'm listening to a tape and I'm transcribing it, I preserve people's grammar and syntax. I do not try to spell their accent because I figure they are looking at the same spelling I'm looking at and they're saying it their way. And I'm not going to pretend, I'm not going to pretend that a white Harvard professor pronounces English the way it's written. Nobody pronounces
Right.
English the way it's written. So the choice to write down the way a white Harvard professor talks as if it was standard English and to write the way a black Southerner talks as if they were talking in a dialect is just, that's a choice to say one person's speech is normal and the other person's
Well,
speech is weird.
I
And I'm
always
not going to go there.
right. Well, I always just say people were fascinated by the Kennedys' accents and things like that at one time.
Yeah,
And I said that's only because the North won the Civil War. If the South had won, we would love some accent from Mississippi.
yeah. No, and exactly. So I'm not going to play that game. Um, I if somebody says I was, what's sort of you was going, I'm not going to change that to you were going, but I'm not going to change you was going,
Well,
with a
I'm glad
I'm
you's
going to put the
here.
G at the end.
I'm
I'm
glad
going to
I'm
write the
right.
G.
I'm glad you's here, well, Elijah Wald.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question about you put together this manuscript. I was wondering, was there any sort of hesitancy on the terms of the publisher publishing this? Was there anything in terms of circulating the manuscript to find a publisher, or was this like a two book deal because of the book you did on the Delta?
No, no, no. There were actually two publishers who wanted it. I mean, I'm by now reasonably well known in
Right.
this world. And Jelly Roll Morton, of course, is well known. This did not seem like it was going to be a hard book to sell. So no problem getting it published. I mean, there were some discussions, that my publisher did bring up the question of whether the N word should be printed in
Hmm.
full. And my response was yes. I mean, if I were reading the book,
Right.
and I should actually say, pause for one moment. I have the audiobook version of this book is read by Mela Lee. She's a Black woman actor, and she is superb. And I definitely felt like this was a book that I don't mind writing this on the page. But in terms of speaking it, I felt like it needed to be a Black actor. I didn't insist it be a Black woman actor, but Mela Lee is
Mm.
wonderful.
Do you
Anyone who likes audiobooks, I would
right,
suggest getting the audiobook
right.
rather than the print book.
Well, talking about label, it would seem that, for example, if I was like a young person, especially coming out of rap or hip hop, it seems that I would want to maybe record like an album of just these key songs or some of them, and just
I
read
would
it
love
myself.
someone to do that.
Yeah, that just seems that would be something that would, with liner notes and things of that sort. But it would seem okay, this coming out right now would serve as a very good touchstone for discussion of the whole field of what we've been saying about lyrics and hip hop and things of that sort.
Yeah, no, I think that, I mean, well, first of all, I should say, some of the verses in this book, though they were collected in the 1890s, you can find Flava Flav and Two Live Crew still doing some verses that were around in the 1890s. I mean, one of the funny things about dirty songs in particular is that every new group of adolescents thinks they invented that
Mm,
stuff. So it never gets old.
mm,
So you have rhymes that people have been doing now for 120, 130, 150 years, and every group of teenagers thinks they're fresh.
mm.
And there are definitely things in this book that if a rapper did them today, people would think they were
Right.
fresh.
Well, I'm not outsourcing material, but I find it interesting. You've done Robert Johnson, you've done Jelly Roll Morton, and I was wondering about why no full book on Buddy Bolden.
Well, I mean, the short answer to that is someone else has done a full book on Buddy Bolden.
Hmm.
I mean, I'm not looking for ideas for books. My books come out of not finding something and wanting to fill a hole.
Okay. Well, before we got on the air, you mentioned what you were currently working on. To talk about the two books that you have as forthcoming books.
Well, I'm doing a short history of rock and roll. That I admit the world doesn't need another history of rock and roll. But I did a short history of blues for Oxford, and it's been translated into a bunch of different languages. And I wanted to do another of those because those are fun. So I'm doing one on rock and roll. Um, and the other one is I did a book, really the first book I did that got a lot of attention was called Narco Corrido. And it's on the modern wave of Mexican narco ballads, the drug ballads of the drug traffic. And that came out now 25 years ago. And an awful lot has happened since then. I
Mm.
mean, the last time I looked, of the top 100 YouTube videos in the United States, 10 of them were Mexican narco corrido things. And outside of that world, nobody knows that world
Mm.
exists.
I want to
So
ask
I
you,
want to do a new edition
right?
of that.
Okay. Before we end, I want to ask you, I think it's a very important question, and that's the process of you writing. I know that, for example, sometimes people do a lot of things online, but then people actually want to go to actual visit collection, which requires money and things of that sort. Are you working on several books at one time? Do you have an assistant that you say, okay, I'll get
No,
sent? No, you have an
no
assistant.
assistant.
All right. Okay. And what about travel funds and stuff like this? Is that all out of your pocket and stuff, or?
Yeah, but also you attach one thing to another thing.
Right.
Like I mean, I also work as a musician. I get invited to give talks
You sound like
places.
you have a day job.
And so I will, like if somebody is inviting, well, perfect example of the stuff on Ready Money in San Diego. Somebody was doing a documentary, an Argentine documentary on Mexican narco corridos, and they wanted to fly me to Los Angeles to do an interview. And I said, I will do it if you will also pay for me to go to San Diego and spend 3 days there.
Hmm. Do you
So
do
that then
right,
paid for me to go to San Diego and do the research on Ready Month.
right.
So, but it's very much, it's a freelancer's life.
Right,
I
right,
mean, you have to cobble together all of these things
right.
to get, here and there and wherever,
Mhm,
and you sleep on people's couches and you do
mhm.
what you need to do.
Do you do like demonstration lectures where you're giving a talk and you say, okay, I'm going to play examples so you can actually hear what I'm
Oh
saying?
yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Both playing recordings and actually this book, I've been doing a lot of it playing live. I bring a guitar and I actually perform the material, which is a little weird in some ways, but in other ways, it just makes the whole thing more lively than a lecture. It's
Now, let
fun.
me let me mention something. I'm not in charge of programming, but it seems Elijah Wald, somebody, so if they're listening, should invite you here to DC to the Library of Congress to give a major
Oh,
presentation.
no, no, believe me, that conversation is happening.
Oh, good.
The only reason that I don't yet have a date at the Library of Congress is in case you haven't noticed, Congress has been having some budget discussions over the last year. And every time they're thinking of inviting me, they look and say, actually, we don't know if we've got the budget till the next vote happens.
It sounds
But
like
no,
you.
no, no, we're having that conversation.
And
They
have you had?
definitely want to do something.
And have you talked to Margie Taylor Greene?
I don't think she's going to be my sponsor.
I don't think so either. On a serious note, in the times that we live in, I can see once there's a building of you, Elijah Wald, at the library conference, there's some people outside picketing because because of the lyrics.
You know, quite frankly, the lucky thing about projects like this is that they are under the radar. I
Hmm.
mean, if I sold enough books, Marjorie Taylor Greene might get annoyed, but as it is, she doesn't know who I am, and I'd like to keep it that way.
Yeah, but I want to let you know, Elijah Wall, you are on the margin, so we know who you are and where you are.
Well, I hope she ain't listening.
Okay, my guest today is Elijah Wall, music journalist, guitarist, and cultural historian. I always love talking with you. We've been talking about his book, Jelly Roll Blues, Censored Songs, and Hidden Histories. So that's Elijah Wall. My name is Ethelbert Miller. The show's on the margin. The station's WPFW 89.3 FM.